As I sit here waiting for our third snowstorm of the week to be done, I'm really looking forward to spring. And with spring comes St. Paddy's Day, and I'm very excited for that as well. For St. Paddy's Day, pretty typically I'm gonna brew either an Irish Stout or an Irish Red Ale. But this year, I'm gonna change it up a little bit, still brewing something very Irish in an Irish Lager. Now, when I say Irish Lager, you guys are probably thinking, and correctly so, Harp Lager is what I'm after here. Now, I can put together a pretty simple standard Euro lager recipe and call it Harp Lager. That's not the way we're gonna do things though. I did a ton of research in preparing for this beer. In my research, I found that the excellent historical English Irish Scottish beer brewing blog, Shut Up About Barclay Perkins by Ron Pattinson, has a great resource on one of the early versions of the Harp Lager. This is the recipe for Harp Lager as brewed by Barclay Perkins when it was originally acquired by the Harp Consortium. Now, I'm not making the exact same recipe today. The recipe I'm making is heavily inspired by this one though. So I do encourage you to check out the article. I've linked it in the description box if you're curious about it, but we're gonna be adapting this for modern brewing techniques with modern ingredients. So all in all, I'm hoping that this particular brew produces a lager that is much different than your average Euro lager and something more akin to what Harp Lager really originally was way back when. Before we get started, I want to give a big shout out to a couple organizations for helping to support the video and make it possible. Firstly, Northern Brewer. Their new warehouse is set up on the East Coast for fast shipping to us, and hopped alpha acids are being printed on packages again, which is excellent. Secondly, Clawhammer Supply, who manufacture the system I'll be brewing today's beer on. I'm going to be using their 10-gallon, 240-volt electric brewing system. If things work out the way I think they will, this beer should be about 4 to 4.5% ABV by the time we're finished here, so it's a pretty small grain bill. We're going to be starting out with not Pilsner malt, actually, but pale ale malt. The recipe by Barclay Perkins has two different varieties of standard English pale malt, and I decided to just go keep it simple and stick with 6 pounds of Simpson's Maris Otter. Maris Otter is a fantastic English base malt, loads of biscuit flavors, and just a really nice rich presentation that's normally used in English ales. I've never tried it with a lager before, so it should be interesting to see what characteristics and qualities are presented by the lager yeast. And that's going to make up 80% of the grist, and then the remaining 20% is going to be made up of flaked maize or flaked corn, which is, you know, that's going to lighten out the body. It's going to definitely lighten the color of the beer. It's going to make it very easy to drink and lower that final gravity to make it extra dry. Should be a nice ingredient. The hops were specified in the recipe as modern varieties we can get nowadays. These are going to be typical noble hops for your standard European lager. We're going to do a 60-minute edition for a total of 12 IBUs split evenly between Hallertau and Satz. That gives me half an ounce of Hallertau at 3.1% alpha acid and a quarter ounce of Satz at 6.5% alpha acid, which is like Cascade levels. That's crazy. Now, I'm normally used to Satz being like 2.5% alpha. And then at the 10-minute mark, we're gonna do 2 IBUs each of Hallertau and Satz, again being half an ounce of Hallertau and a quarter ounce of Satz, giving a total IBU in the recipe of about 17. For the water profile on this beer, it's gonna be oriented towards a pale lager with a crisp finish and a drying quality. So that water profile is gonna have a slightly elevated sulfate to chloride ratio. That water profile is 65 parts per million of calcium, 3 parts per million of magnesium, 26 parts per million of sodium, 88 parts per million of chloride, 105 parts per million of sulfate, and 0 parts per million of bicarbonate. Depending on your setup, it might be beneficial to you to pre-acidify your water with some lactic acid, as this is a very pale grist. To get that water profile, I'm going to start out with 8 gallons of reverse osmosis water and add to that 3 grams of calcium chloride, 2 grams of sodium chloride, 1 gram of Epsom, and 5 grams of gypsum. For the yeast on this beer, we're going to go with the standard global lager strain, Weihenstephaner 3470 or Saflager W3470 in the dry form that I'll be using today. This is also available as Wyeast 2124 or Imperial Global. It is the most common, easy to find lager strain out there, and it is ubiquitous around the world for a very good reason. It makes very clean and solid beers and is a very forgiving strain of yeast. For the mash on this beer, it's going to be a standard step mash. I want this beer to still retain a little bit of body while still also being very dry. So we're going to do a Hoch-Kurtz style 2-step mash that I usually do for lagers. And that's going to be 45 minutes at 148 Fahrenheit to bring out that high attenuation level, and then 30 minutes at 158 Fahrenheit to retain a little bit of body and have some longer chain sugars still in the mix for a good balanced beer. We'll finish it off with a 15-minute mash out at 170. I'm also going to add, I'm going to do this one again as an overnight mash. I typically program my controller to execute the mash schedule in the steps that I just outlined. It'll automatically step through those. Then I'll bring it back down to the mid-150s to sit there until I come back the following morning to finish off the brew day. I'm a huge fan of overnight mashes. They save me a ton of time and allow me to spend more time with my family while still enjoying my hobby, which to me is an absolute win. I've never had any issues with the beer quality with this approach, and in fact, in many ways, it's a more efficient brew day than I had before. I'm excited to get this one going, guys, so I'll catch you downstairs in the brewery.
Firstly, I filled up my kettle with 8 gallons of reverse osmosis water and started to heat that up to the target first rest temperature of 148 Fahrenheit. While the water was heating up, I milled out the 6 pounds of Maris Otter, leaving the 2 pounds of corn for mashing in on their own. These do not need to be milled. I also measured out all of my water salts and added those into the strike water as it was heating up. Once I reached my target rest temperature of 148, I dough'd in with the entire grain bill, including the corn, and mixed everything up thoroughly. There were definitely quite a few dough balls to break up in this batch, but that's not a big deal. Once they were all broken up, I let the mash sit where it was at 148 for about 10 minutes, and then I pulled a quick sample for a pH confirmation. I found the pH to be actually surprisingly low at 4.93. Which is crazy because I didn't add any acid into the water at all. That being said, 4.93 measured at a relatively hot temperature like I was measuring it does imply a higher pH in reality, probably somewhere around 5.1 to 5.2. I did not do anything to adjust the pH in this brew and allowed it to continue on and step through the mash schedule. As I mentioned in the recipe section, the Blickman Brew Commander was programmed to automatically step through the mash as I specified it. So 45 minutes at 148, followed by 30 minutes at 158, followed by 15 minutes at 170, and then dropping back down to about 152 for the rest of the night. I let it continue through this process and came back the next morning. When I came back, I saw that the mash was sitting at 152, and I pulled out the grain basket and allowed that to drain for about half an hour as I got distracted doing other things. Once I got back, I pulled the grain basket off, raised the temperature of the wort up to boiling, and added my first hop addition, which was half an ounce of Hallertau and a quarter ounce of Satz. I let the boil carry on for 50 minutes, and then at the 10-minute mark, I added my 10-minute hop addition, which was, again, a half an ounce of Hallertau and a quarter ounce of Satz. And then I also added in some Whirlflock and yeast nutrient as well. I let the boil continue for another 10 minutes, and then I ended it and sent it through my counterflow chiller into my Brewbuilt X2. I didn't even bother whirlpooling this beer because there really wasn't that much as far as trub and hops go. So just sent everything through the counterflow chiller into the Brewbuilt, and it was fine. I let the Brewbuilt X2's glycol jacket take care of chilling the wort from 75 degrees down to about 60 degrees for my yeast pitch, and at this point I pitched in my 1 packet of Harp Lager W3470. At this point I also measured my OG, found it to be what was targeted at 1042. For good measure, I also added in a dropper full of ALDC and left it to ferment.
For the fermentation on this beer, I really encourage you to treat it like it's a proper German lager. The reason why I say that is because Harp was originally brewed by a German brewer who was developing a lager for Guinness. German lager brewing principles abound within this entire recipe, so it's important to consider German fermentation principles for lager as well. Even though I'm going to be using W3470, which is an extremely versatile lager yeast that can ferment all the way up to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe even a little higher, and be 100% clean, I'm still choosing to bring it back down to a much more normal lager temperature. So I'm going to be fermenting mine at about 60 degrees, which is actually still a little warm for a lager technically, but the point being, it's going to be a cooler fermentation than it could be. The reason for this is I just want to absolutely guarantee it is a squeaky clean lager character with absolutely no flavor whatsoever. By keeping it around 60 degrees, I'm doing two things. Number one, I am not going to be fermenting to a point where I risk any chance of any ester whatsoever. But I'm also not going to be fermenting it so cold that I encourage sulfur production. This is a good middle ground temperature for 3470 that keeps it as clean as it possibly can be. The total fermentation time for this beer at 60 degrees, I think will be about 7 to 10 days. It'll go a lot faster if you ferment it a lot warmer, and conversely, it'll go slower if you ferment it lower. But the point is I want to have enough time here to react and go through the typical stages of a lager fermentation. You can either keep it at 60 degrees the entire time, or you can raise it a few degrees a day to about 65 degrees for a diacetyl rest, which I don't think we're going to need. But I digress. The key point though is at the tail end of that fermentation, when there's about 10% of the expected fermentables left to be fermented, it's time to spund the beer. That means getting this into a pressure-capable vessel and capping it up and letting that remaining piece of fermentation take place to create carbonation within the beer and naturally carbonate itself. For me, that typically is going to be like the last 3 to 4 gravity points that are expected to ferment. At that point, I will just pop a spunding valve on the fermenter, because I'm going to be using a unitank, so I can just do this all in the same exact fermenter. Pop a spunding valve in that thing, set it to about 10 to 12 psi, and let it continue the fermentation and finish out. Once the fermentation is complete, then it'll start bringing it down to a cold temperature, as cold as possible, to get that CO2 that's generated to absorb into the beer, and also to begin the lagering process. We will lager this beer for, I would guess, about 3 to 5 weeks overall. Right now it's early February. I want this ready for St. Patrick's Day, obviously, but I'll probably publish the video in the beginning of March. Once that carbonation's been absorbed into the beer though, I'm gonna close transfer into a keg, lagering it in the keg for the remaining 3 to 5 weeks. If you want to speed up this process, add a little gelatin. Doesn't hurt to do that. This is an Irish lager, so it doesn't have to conform to the Reinheitsgebot, so no one needs to come after me for that one. It's got corn in it anyway, so whatever. The cold side on these beers is really important, because if you want it to be crisp and refreshing and clear and just have that snappiness and that classic crispiness, you need to lager it. You need to let it sit in the keg or in the fermenter cold as hell for a very long time. That's the only way to get it to really crisp up. You can clarify it quickly with gelatin, but that doesn't get you all of the crispness. It helps a lot, but it doesn't get you the whole picture. There's really something magical about that long lagering period, and all you have to do is get it in the keg and forget about it for a long time. For alternate lager strains in this one, it could be a lot of things. Like, it's really ultimately up to you, the brewer and the designer of the recipe, to kind of figure out what you want out of it. But for the purposes of the video, I'll give you a couple options. Now, in my case, I want a super squeaky clean fermentation with 0 fermentation character and 0 sulfur that's done in a reasonable amount of time and is honestly not too finicky. And the perfect strain for that, of course, is the Weihenstephan 3470. Now, if you want this to be a little bit maltier, a little bit fuller, a little bit more, I guess, flavorful overall, you could look into using one of the Munich lagers. The Imperial L17 Harvest, the Augustiner strain, which I love that strain, very much so. It is very malty though. You could look into something even more malty like the German Bock, the Eyinger strain. That will get you a very malty beer, which in my opinion is not really suited for what this is, but it could be perfectly fine. If you want something that's going to have a little bit more fermentation character, maybe a little bit more personality to it, while still being a very high-performing lager yeast, go with the Budvar strain of Czech lager yeast. This is WLP 802. And of course you can go for something that's a little bit more of the Americanized macro lager style strain, and that would be WLP 840, the Budweiser strain. All of these are great options, and they're available from multiple retailers and multiple yeast companies. I'm not going to go through the exhaustive list here. What I would encourage you to do though is just consider what characteristics do you want out of the fermentation on this. And then from there, decide which way you want to go towards what yeast. Do you want it malty? Do you want it dry? Do you want it clean? Do you want it with a little bit of fermentation character? Do you want a different kind of mouthfeel? That sort of thing. Yeast will impact all of those things, and it's an important thing to consider when you're selecting your strain. And of course, you could also use a clean fermenting neutral kveik, such as Lutra or Oslo, to get a very similar result. If you are going down that road though, I would recommend paying attention to your pH and adjusting your pH up a little bit, because there will be a natural kveik pH drop during the fermentation, bringing your final beer pH down a little bit lower than if you had otherwise used a standard lager strain. But anyway, just to recap, I'm going to be fermenting my beer with Fermentis W3470, and I will be fermenting it at 60 degrees for pretty much the entirety of the fermentation. I will slowly ramp up to 65 at the very end of fermentation and spund with the last 3 to 4 gravity points of expected fermentation time. After that, I will get it down to a nice cold temperature, close transfer into a keg, and lager it in the keg for the next 3 to 5 weeks, or until it is clean, clear, and crispy. At that point, it will be ready to serve, and I'm very excited to see what happens then. So until then, sláinte.
Fermentation for this beer went very fast, which is, all things considered, not surprising whatsoever. 3470 is known to be a very quick fermenter in general, and especially more so when it's fermented at slightly higher temperatures. As you can see from the plot from my Tilt Pro, it fermented all the way down to 1006 in about 3.5 days, which is a perfectly acceptable fermentation time frame. I let it sit there on the yeast for a few more days, confirming it later with my Anton Par Smart Ref, finding that final gravity of 1006 to be accurate. This put us at a very comfortable 4.8% ABV. So at this point, I kegged it and got it into my kegerator to start the lagering process. This beer is called Vogelballig, and it comes in at 4.8% ABV and 16 IBUs. For the appearance of the beer, it is pouring a pale gold color, and it is actually brightly clear. It is perfectly clear. Has a really, really nice clarity that just is enjoyable to watch with the high carbonation levels. The head on the beer is a stark white color, a nice construction, but it falls relatively fast. It doesn't really stay on the surface or leave any sort of lacing. A little bit of research tells me this is pretty commonplace with lagers that are very dry finishing like this one and have a large amount of corn in the grist. Not sure exactly why that is, but it certainly is observable here.
Alright, so now let's go in for aroma. Off of the aroma, it's very, very light, but what I am getting is a floral hop element, as well as a little bit of sweet malt, and maybe a bit of corn. Getting a lot of grassiness, actually, as well. But it really does just smell like a standard pale macro lager. Perhaps with a bit more hop expression, a little bit more spiciness. There's definitely more to it than just a standard Miller Lite, if you know what I mean. Although it's very similar. Not too much to offer here on the aroma, but then again, this is not really meant to be an aromatic beer. It's meant to be an easy drinker. Speaking of which, let's go in now for the mouthfeel. Nailed it! Now, when I say easy drinker, I mean easy drinker. This thing is absolutely poundable. It's very, very, very light-bodied, very easy to drink, and has that nice crisp and refreshing character to it. This is the kind of beer that you would chug after you just ran 10 miles in the summer heat. It is absolutely perfect for that. It's got a nice edge to it, very clean, very, very crisp. One thing also to note here is that I did add a lot of carbonation to this beer. I mean, these are typically beer styles that are going to be pretty heavily carbonated, so that does help bring a lot of life to them. It helps make them even more refreshing, and it certainly does work in this case as well. And maybe that's a little bit of a futile effort to try and keep the head from collapsing, but it's still doing something to it, I think. There's a little bit of a layer, which is good. I don't know why, but there is just something about clear beer that is so fun. Anyway, it's time for us to go in for flavor. I will say this before we jump into it. This beer is not meant to be an extremely high level of flavor. It's meant to be easily drinkable, enjoyable, but it's really secondary to, I think, you know, going down to the pub and having a good time. Therefore, there's not that much flavor to this, but what is there is certainly noticeable, and it's got a prominent corn character to it. That should not be surprising in the slightest. But there's also a pretty assertive, noble hop presence here too. Between the Hallertau and the Saaz, the best of both of them are coming out, but I really do think I get more of the Saaz character in this. That lemony zestiness that Saaz is known for. I think we're back to getting good Saaz now, which is great, but that lemony character is so distinctive, and it's something that is very present in the bitterness on this beer, which is perfectly balanced, by the way. But yeah, I get that herbal character, and I get a little bit of that floral Hallertau. There's definitely a little bit of corn puff kind of sweetness in there. And then malt-wise, I'm not really able to pick up anything distinctive about this. Even though I used Maris Otter as the base malt, you would not be able to tell in any way, shape, or form that I used it based on the flavor alone. I think the giveaway here is the color, because this beer is certainly not as pale as if I had used Pilsner malt, but I would not be able to tell the difference between this Pilsner malt, any other base malt, to be honest. It's just that light, that dry. There's perhaps a little bit more of like a lighter straw flavor coming through, little grassiness. It reminds me the most of like a Miller Lite. It really does. I cannot tell you the last time I had Harp. It was a very, very long time ago, I think. So I can't tell you really if this is, you know, a true clone or not of the beer. That being said, I would consider this to be very true to the style in terms of an international pale lager or, you know, a macro Euro Pils. This is a beer that I certainly wish I had on during like the height of summer, because it's that kind of just super refreshing hot weather beer. You know, it's the kind of thing I'd drink next to like a pool or something, or on the beach. But that being said, it certainly is very solid for St. Patrick's Day. I just think it's fun to have something that's different than an Irish Red or an Irish Stout on tap this time. I certainly had a lot of fun making this because it's the first truly like light lager that I've made in a long time. So I'm enjoying that. As far as potential improvements for this one go, it's hard to say because, you know, this is a pretty true to style beer. But for what I personally prefer in my paler lagers, I would like a little bit more head retention on this guy. One thing I can maybe do here is limit the attenuation as much. That might help cut down the corn contribution a little bit, replace some of that corn with some high protein Pilsner malts, and I think that might get the job done. But otherwise, yeah, I mean, it is what it is. It's pretty good. I think the hops came through beautifully this time. Maybe a little bit less Saaz, because that lemon character does really punch through. A little bit more Hallertau, or maybe if you're feeling spicy, some Tettnang. That might be pretty good. But these are more like suggestions, not really potential improvements. And yes, I know some of you may be upset about the fact that I'm drinking this from a Guinness glass, which should not have a lager in it ever. I was corrected on that earlier, which is fine. But I thought it'd be kind of a nice tribute to the fact that Guinness did brew the original Harp Lager, and I thought it was fitting. But anyway, guys, that's all I got for you. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you make this beer, and if you do, please let me know if you did. And if you liked the video, enjoyed it, found it fun, found it useful, whatever, please go ahead, hit that like button before you leave. It really does help out. And comment down below with your thoughts on everything. Don't forget to subscribe as well if you haven't already. And if you want to help support the channel, please consider picking up a t-shirt. You can get this design and plenty of others on my merchandise store, which is linked down in the description box. I also have a Patreon, and my patrons are one of the primary sources of funding this channel's activities. You guys are the reason why I'm able to fund things like production quality upgrades and getting interesting brewing gadgets like the beer engine and the can seamer and stuff like that. That all comes from Patreon funding, and it's something that I take very seriously. So I really do appreciate your support in all aspects of it. If Patreon is not your thing though, I also have channel memberships, and there's the super thanks button as quick and easy ways to help support the channel as well. There's also an Amazon store where you can find all of the interesting brewing equipment that's available on Amazon, as well as the channel production equipment if you're curious about that stuff. And I'm also available on Instagram and Facebook as the Apartment Brewer if you want to stay up to date with some more frequent content and see what's going to be coming to the channel in the relatively near future. I also post a couple of the random things in there too, so it's fun to check out. Anyway, guys, if you're still here, thank you very much for watching all the way to the end of the video. It means a lot to me. I put a lot of effort into these things. They take a very long time to make, so it means a lot that you're watching the entire thing, because it means you're getting something out of it. So this one goes out to you guys who are still watching at this point. Have a happy, wonderful St. Patrick's Day. Pinch me, I'm not wearing green, sorry. Whatever. This one goes out to you, so until the next one, Sláinte.